Hi everyone, my name is Cal. I'm a solutions engineer here at Spacelift, and today we're going to be doing a high-level overview of stack dependencies. If you do need something more in-depth or want to see some live examples, we do have another video on this, and it'll be linked below. So to get started, what are stack dependencies? Essentially, it's a way for one stack to trigger another stack within Spacelift. And if you didn't know, stacks are kind of like workspaces in Terraform Cloud or Enterprise. They're kind of like your pipelines in your CI/CD workflows. So having one stack do some kind of job and then trigger another stack. And there'd be some kind of options on passing outputs as well. For example, having a Terraform stack or an OpenTofu stack spinning up infrastructure, spitting out some outputs like the EC2 IP, which then some other stacks, kind of like Ansible, can take, build an inventory file out of that, and then be able to modify and configure that infrastructure. So that's a high-level overview. Let's just go through some of these docs and talk about some examples. So coming down here, we got a Terraform stack. Terraform is an IAC tool, and it can output some variables. And those variables can then be consumed with other stacks. For example, Ansible, Kubernetes. By default, Ansible and Kubernetes don't have anything like similar to outputs, but they can consume them from Terraform stacks. So you can have your infrastructure deploy and then have Kubernetes stacks deploy Kubernetes stuff like namespaces, deployments on that new infrastructure. Say if it's an EKS cluster, you can do it that way, or you can have Ansible then go in, if it's an EC2 instance, for example, configure on that EC2 instance, like installing dependencies, third-party tools, etc. So going through some scenarios that we have here, you can have some kind of like infrastructure deployment, pass some outputs like a VPC ID, which then database infrastructure deployments can then consume, and then spin up some database environments. And then when the database environment is up, it can output some kind of like connection string, which then different services, for example, a payment service, can then consume after that. So you're controlling the workflow of like A to Z on how things are being flowing. Moving on to another scenario here, we have some infrastructure spinning up, and then after it spins up, spits out a VPC ID, database comes in, but now we're having branching off to two different stacks after that. For example, payment services and card services. These two stacks depend on the database stack. So once the database stack does come up, which is also dependent on the infrastructure stack, so you're essentially creating a workflow that says, have my infrastructure deploy first. If it's successful, deploy my database. If it's successful, then in parallel, deploy my payment services and my card services. And you can get really nitty-gritty with this and have large stacks being deployed. For example, having your base infra, that's triggering your networking, database, and storage stacks. And if and only if those stacks come up properly, then you'll have other stacks like card services and payment services coming up after that. So here are just some few examples. Scenario one, baseline infra deploys fine. And then in parallel, we'll have our database, networking, and storage deploy. And then for these two bottom stacks, payment services and card services, since they're not dependent on the storage stack, as soon as the database and networking stack are up and running, these two stacks will then proceed and deploy. And then here's just another scenario. And here we're passing in a connection string. So you can also pass some output variables as needed. Another scenario here is where we have a networking stack fail. So the infrastructure did not come up, which means once the baseline info came up, all three of these stacks ran in parallel. Networking failed. And as soon as networking fails, it puts the other two stacks to a skipped mode. So it stops the entire process there. So you're not deploying things that are dependent on something when it's failing. And then lastly, I think, second last, we have another scenario here where everything is passing fine. So baseline is coming up. Your next three stacks, database, networking, storage come up. And then payment services and card services come up. And then in scenario 5, we have another example of where the storage stack is being depended on by another stack called storage service. And the storage stack also has an output of a bucket arm. But if that value is already provided, it will just skip it and not activate that last stack. But if that value is not there, then it will reach out and spin up another stack. So you can get really customized with how you want your stack dependencies programmed, and it's essentially dependent on how you want your infrastructure running. So that is it for Stack Dependencies overview. Please take a look at our next videos. It will go more in depth and showcase an example. Thank you.